The sound came first, a deep, throaty roar that rattled windows and shook the ground. Then came the silhouette, blocky and massive against the European sky. German pilots squinted upward from their cockpits, watching what looked more like a flying milk bottle than a fighter plane. They laughed. They called it Die Jug, the Jug. A thick, ungainly American contraption that surely couldn't match the sleek Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs they'd been flying since the war began. That laughter didn't last long. By the time the war ended, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had destroyed more enemy aircraft than any other American fighter in the European theater. It had delivered more ordnance than any other fighter bomber in history. And those German pilots who'd survived encounters with it had learned to scan the sky with genuine fear, knowing that the Jug carried 8 50 caliber machine guns, each capable of firing 50 rounds per minute, and was piloted by men who'd learned to use every ounce of the aircraft's unprecedented power. This is the story of how an airplane that looked like a joke became the most devastating fighter bomber of World War II, and how American ingenuity turned mockery into terror at 30,000 feet. The beast was born from desperation and genius in equal measure. In 1940, the world was watching Europe burn. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies over France, Poland, and the Low Countries. Britain stood alone, its pilots exhausted, flying Spitfires and Hurricanes in endless rotations against wave after wave of German bombers and fighters. America wasn't yet in the war, but military planners could read the writing on the sky. The Army Air Corps needed a fighter that could do something no fighter had done before. Escort bombers all the way from England to targets deep inside Germany and back again. This meant range, lots of it. It meant high-altitude performance where the thin air choked most engines, and it meant the ability to fight and win against experienced Luftwaffe pilots, flying some of the finest aircraft ever built. Republic Aviation Corporation, based in Farmingdale, New York, took on the challenge. The company's chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, was a Georgian immigrant who'd fled the Russian Revolution and brought with him a willingness to think beyond conventional wisdom. Kartveli looked at the requirements and made a radical decision. While other designers were trying to make fighters smaller and lighter, he would make his bigger and heavier than anything anyone had seen. At the heart of Kartveli's design was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, a massive radial power plant that produced 2,000 horsepower. Later variants would push 2,800 horsepower with water injection. This engine was enormous, nearly 4 feet in diameter. Most designers would have seen it as too large, too heavy for a fighter. Kartveli saw it as the key to everything. That engine, properly turbocharged, could push a fighter to altitudes where German interceptors gasped for air. It could haul a pilot home even when half its cylinders had been shot away. And it could turn that big, heavy airframe into a projectile that dove faster than anything else in the sky. But mounting that massive engine created problems. The propeller needed to be large enough to absorb all that power, 13 feet in diameter. To keep that propeller from striking the ground, Kartveli needed long landing gear. To house long landing gear, he needed a deep fuselage. To feed that engine at high altitude, he needed a turbocharger with ducting running from the engine to the turbocharger in the tail and back again. Every solution created bulk. Every requirement added weight. When the XP-47B prototype first flew in May 1941, it weighed 12,500 pounds, nearly twice the weight of the P-51 Mustang that would later share escort duties. It was enormous. Pilots who transitioned from P-40s and P-39s climbed into the cockpit and looked down at wings that seemed to stretch forever. The fuselage was so deep they felt like they were sitting in a bathtub. German pilots took one look and started making jokes. But Kartveli and his team had built something special into that massive frame. They'd created the world's first fighter designed from the beginning as a complete weapon system. 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns were mounted in the wings, 4 per side. Each gun was fed by a belt holding between 267 and 425 rounds depending on position. When a P-47 pilot pressed the trigger, all 8 guns fired simultaneously, sending 100 rounds per second of armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer ammunition downrange. The combined weight of fire was 5 times that of a Spitfire. A 1-second burst put nearly 3 pounds of lead and steel into the air. The effect on target was devastating. German fighters built around light frames and air-cooled engines disintegrated under that hail of fire. A P-47's guns could saw a Bf-109 in half. They could turn a Focke-Wulf 190 into a fireball. They could shred a bomber's wing so thoroughly that it simply folded up and fell away. Luftwaffe pilots who survived encounters with Thunderbolts reported seeing their wingmen simply explode, their aircraft coming apart so quickly there was no time to bail out. But the guns were only part of the story. What made the P-47 truly deadly was what it could survive. Republic's engineers had built-in redundancy and armor that gave pilots a fighting chance against the 20mm and 30mm cannon shells German fighters carried. The cockpit was surrounded by armor plate. The oil cooler and engine were protected. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, lined with rubber that would swell and plug holes when struck by bullets. The radial engine, with its 18 cylinders arranged in a star pattern, could lose half its cylinders and keep running. Pilots learned that their Thunderbolt could take damage that would destroy any other fighter and still bring them home. Robert Johnson's experience on June 26, 1943 became legendary among P-47 pilots. Johnson, flying with the 56th Fighter Group, had just downed a German fighter when a Focke-Wulf 190 appeared behind him. Before he could react, 20mm cannon shells ripped into his aircraft. The canopy shattered. Shells tore through the fuselage, destroying the radio, severing control cables and shredding the tail section. Johnson's flight suit was torn, his body peppered with plexiglass fragments. His aircraft was hemorrhaging fuel and hydraulic fluid. The Focke-Wulf pilot pulled alongside, saw Johnson slumped in the cockpit and assumed he'd made the kill. But Johnson was conscious and his engine was still running. As the German fighter turned away, Johnson pushed the stick forward and dove. The P-47, even shot full of holes, accelerated like a falling anvil. Johnson crossed the English Channel barely 50 feet above the waves, expecting his engine to quit at any moment. It didn't. He made it back to base and bellied in on a runway. When maintenance crews examined his aircraft, they counted more than 200 hits. The airplane never flew again, but Johnson walked away. Within days, he was back in combat. Stories like Johnson's spread through the fighter groups. Pilots learned to trust their aircraft. They learned that when combat went wrong, when they were outnumbered or surprised, the Thunderbolt would take punishment and keep flying. This confidence changed how they fought. They became more aggressive, more willing to press attacks against superior numbers, knowing that even if they took hits, they had a good chance of making it home. The P-47 arrived in England in late 1942, and the first combat missions began in April 1943. The early results were mixed. The 56th Fighter Group and the 4th Fighter Group began flying escort missions for bomber formations, striking targets in occupied France and the Low Countries. German fighters rose to meet them, and the learning curve was steep. Luftwaffe pilots had years of combat experience. They knew every trick, every tactic. American pilots were learning on the job, and they paid for their education with blood. The problem wasn't the aircraft, it was how pilots were using it. The Thunderbolt was not a dogfighter in the traditional sense. It couldn't turn with a Messerschmitt 109 or a Spitfire. That massive weight and wing loading meant that in a slow-speed turning fight, more nimble aircraft could get inside the P-47's turn radius. Early on, American pilots tried to fight the way they'd been taught, mixing it up in turning engagements where their German opponents held the advantage. They died. Then pilots like Hub Zemke, commanding officer of the 56th Fighter Group, began figuring out how to fight to the Thunderbolt's strengths. The key was altitude and speed. The P-47 could outclimb anything the Luftwaffe flew. It could reach altitudes above 40,000 feet where German fighters struggled. And once at altitude, it could convert that height into devastating diving attacks. Zemke and other tacticians developed what became known as boom and zoom. P-47 pilots would climb above the German formations, use their superior altitude to spot targets, then dive at tremendous speed. The Thunderbolt could exceed 500 miles per hour in a dive without breaking up, make a firing pass, and use their momentum to climb back to altitude. German pilots who tried to follow found their aircraft couldn't keep up. The P-47 would pull away, climb out of range, and set up for another pass. If a German fighter somehow got on a Thunderbolt's tail, the American pilot had options. He could dive, and nothing could follow a P-47 in a dive. He could use the aircraft's excellent roll rate to jink and spoil the German's aim. Or he could simply run for home at full throttle, the big Pratt & Whitney engine pulling him away from pursuit. German pilots learned that once a Thunderbolt decided to disengage, catching it was nearly impossible. By mid-1943, the P-47's reputation was growing. German pilots began calling out sightings of thunderbolts over the radio with genuine concern. The jokes about the jug faded, replaced by respect and fear. American pilots were racking up kills. Francis Gabreski, flying with the 56th Fighter Group, would end the war with 28 victories, making him the top American ace in Europe. Robert Johnson finished with 27. Both flew P-47s for most of their combat tours. But the P-47's greatest contribution wasn't in air-to-air combat. It was in ground attack. As 1943 turned into 1944, Allied planners were preparing for the invasion of France. That invasion would require absolute air superiority. And air superiority meant destroying the Luftwaffe not just in the air but on the ground. It meant wrecking German transportation networks, destroying fuel depots, obliterating anything that could support the Wehrmacht's ability to fight. The P-47 proved perfect for this mission. Its rugged construction meant it could fly low, through intense anti-aircraft fire, and survive. Its 8 machine guns could strafe trains, trucks, and troop concentrations with devastating effect. And it could carry bombs, eventually up to 2,500 pounds of ordnance on external racks. A P-47 could take off carrying a pair of 1,000-pound bombs, fly to a target in France or Germany, drop its bombs on a rail yard or bridge, then strafe targets of opportunity on the way home. If German fighters appeared, it could jettison any remaining ordnance and fight its way clear. The transition to ground attack was dangerous. Anti-aircraft fire at low altitude was intense, and it didn't care how tough your airplane was. A direct hit from an 80mm flak shell would destroy any aircraft. But the P-47's rugged construction gave pilots a margin of survival. They could take hits from smaller caliber flak, 20mm and 37mm shells, that would down other fighters and keep flying. Pilots learned to come in fast and low, make one pass, and get out. The Germans couldn't track them effectively at those speeds and altitudes. In the months leading up to D-Day, P-47s ranged across occupied France, destroying anything that moved. They caught trains in the open and left them burning wrecks. They found German truck convoys moving at night and turned them into infernos. They hit bridges, ammunition dumps, fuel storage facilities, and communication centers. The Luftwaffe, already weakened by years of attrition on the Eastern Front and over Germany itself, couldn't protect these assets. German ground forces reported that daytime movement was becoming suicidal. The sky belonged to the Americans, and the P-47 was the instrument of that dominance. On June 6, 1944, when Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, P-47s were overhead in force. They flew continuous patrols, preventing any significant Luftwaffe interference with the landings. They struck German positions just inland from the beaches, disrupting counterattacks before they could form. They provided close air support for troops fighting through the hedgerows of the Bocage, dropping bombs and napalm on German strongpoints that were holding up the advance. The pilots who flew these missions developed tactics that would influence close air support doctrine for decades. They learned to work with forward air controllers on the ground, identifying targets and delivering ordnance with precision. They learned to distinguish friendly from enemy forces, to avoid hitting their own troops while engaging the enemy just yards away. They learned to make multiple passes despite intense ground fire, knowing that the soldiers below were depending on them. One pilot, Quince Brown of the 78th Fighter Group, described a mission over France in July 1944. His flight had been called in to support American troops pinned down by German armor. Brown located the target, 3 German tanks hull down behind a hedgerow firing on American positions. He rolled in with a pair of 500-pound bombs, released them directly in front of the German position, and pulled up through a storm of anti-aircraft fire. Looking back, he saw one tank burning and the other 2 withdrawing. Ground controllers reported that the American troops had been able to advance. It was the kind of mission P-47 pilots flew dozens of times a day, all across the front. As Allied forces broke out of Normandy and began the race across France, P-47s ranged ahead of the advancing columns, clearing the way. They destroyed German forces trying to establish defensive lines. They cut off retreat routes, trapping entire German units that were then destroyed by Allied ground forces. They created such chaos in the German rear areas that Wehrmacht commanders lost control of their formations, unable to coordinate movements or concentrate forces for counterattacks. The P-47's ability to carry rockets added another dimension to its ground attack capability. Beginning in late 1944, many Thunderbolts were equipped with zero-length launchers for 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, HVARs. Each rocket hit with the explosive force of a 5-inch naval shell. A P-47 could carry 10 of these weapons, along with bombs and full ammunition for its 8 machine guns. This combination made it capable of destroying any target short of heavy fortifications. Pilots used these weapons against German armor with devastating effect. Tank crews learned to fear the sound of a P-47's engine overhead. The Americans had developed tactics for attacking armor, diving attacks from the rear where armor was thinnest, using rockets to disable tanks, then following up with strafing runs to finish off the crew if they bailed out. German tank commanders reported that their Panthers and Tigers, nearly invulnerable to most Allied ground weapons, were helpless against air attack. The psychological effect of the P-47's ground attack campaign was as important as the physical destruction. German soldiers learned that any movement in daylight drew immediate air attack. Supply trucks stopped moving during the day. Troop movements happened only at night. Command and control deteriorated as communications networks were destroyed and rebuilt. Destroyed again. Abandoned. The Wehrmacht, which had pioneered combined arms warfare and close air support with the Luftwaffe in the early years of the war, found itself on the receiving end of an air campaign that was more intense, more effective, and more sustained than anything they'd inflicted on their enemies. The Luftwaffe tried to fight back. They developed new tactics, flying low to avoid radar detection, then climbing rapidly to attack Allied bombers and fighters. They concentrated their remaining forces for maximum effect, throwing dozens of fighters at bomber formations in coordinated attacks. They introduced new aircraft, the FW-190D, the Me-262 jet fighter, the TA-152, in desperate attempts to regain some measure of air superiority. None of it mattered. The numbers were overwhelming. By late 1944, the USAF was deploying thousands of fighters over Europe every day. The P-47 groups alone could put hundreds of aircraft over any battlefield within hours. German pilots, no matter how skilled or determined, couldn't compete with that weight of metal. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and flying against pilots who'd learned their trade in the hardest school imaginable, combat against experienced enemies. The final months of the war saw P-47s ranging over Germany itself, attacking targets that had been untouchable earlier in the war. They struck airfields deep in Germany, destroying aircraft on the ground before they could take off. They hit oil refineries and synthetic fuel plants, completing the work that strategic bombers had begun. They strafed anything that moved on Germany's roads and railways, turning the country's transportation network into a graveyard of burning vehicles and wrecked trains. German civilians reported that the sound of American fighters had become constant, a backdrop to daily life. The Thunderbolt's distinctive engine note, deeper and throatier than other fighters, became synonymous with defeat. When people heard that sound, they ran for cover, knowing that death could come from the sky at any moment. The statistics tell part of the story. By war's end, P-47s had flown more than 546,000 combat sorties in the European theater. They destroyed 7,067 enemy aircraft, 3,652 in the air and 3,315 on the ground. They destroyed or damaged thousands of locomotives, tens of thousands of railroad cars, countless trucks and tanks and other vehicles. They dropped 132,000 tons of bombs. They'd fired more than 135 million rounds of ammunition. No other fighter in the European theater came close to matching these numbers. But statistics don't capture what it was like. They don't describe the experience of pilots who flew 2 or 3 missions a day, every day for months on end. They don't convey the terror of diving through flak so thick it looked like you could walk on it, or the triumph of seeing a German fighter disintegrate under your guns, or the exhaustion of landing after a 4-hour mission knowing you'd have to do it again tomorrow. The pilots who flew the P-47 developed a bond with their aircraft that went beyond mere professional respect. They knew that their survival depended on the toughness and reliability of the machine they flew. They'd seen friends shot down in other aircraft types, and they knew that in a Thunderbolt those friends might have made it home. They'd experienced the gut-wrenching fear of taking hits and watching pieces of their aircraft fly off, only to feel the reassuring vibration of that big Pratt & Whitney engine still pulling them through the sky. They gave their aircraft names, painted nose art on them, counted missions on the fuselage with bombs and swastikas. Each P-47 had its own personality, little quirks that pilots learned to accommodate. Some pulled to the left in a climb, some burned oil and smoked, some had guns that wouldn't fire in certain positions. Pilots learned their aircraft the way a driver learns a familiar car, knowing exactly how it would respond in any situation. When the war ended in May 1945, there were mixed feelings among P-47 pilots. Relief, certainly, they'd survived. Pride in what they'd accomplished, but also a kind of melancholy recognition that they'd participated in something terrible and necessary, and that the aircraft they'd trusted with their lives would soon be obsolete. The jet age was already arriving. The P-47's piston engine and propeller were being superseded by turbojets that promised higher speeds and better high-altitude performance. Within a few years, the USAF would retire most of its Thunderbolts, replacing them with F-86 Sabres and other jet fighters. Some P-47s served on with Air National Guard units through the 1950s. Others went to Allied nations, France, Brazil, Turkey, and others, where they served for another decade. But the days of the big radial fighters were ending, yet the P-47's legacy endured. The tactics developed by Thunderbolt pilots, boom and zoom air combat, coordinated ground attack, close air support procedures, became standard doctrine. The emphasis on rugged construction and pilot survivability influenced fighter design for generations. The idea that a fighter should be more than just a weapons platform, that it should be a complete system designed to keep its pilot alive while delivering devastating firepower, became fundamental to American military aviation, and the men who flew it never forgot. In the decades after the war, P-47 pilots gathered at reunions telling stories, comparing experiences, remembering friends who didn't make it home. They spoke with genuine affection about their aircraft, that big, heavy, ungainly beast that had kept them alive through the worst war in history. They laughed at the old German nickname, the Jug. But their laughter was different from the laughter of those Luftwaffe pilots who'd first seen the P-47 and thought it was a joke. Their laughter carried knowledge earned in blood and fire. The German pilots who survived the war and encountered P-47s had a different perspective. In memoirs and interviews, they spoke with respect about the American fighter and the men who flew it. They described the terror of seeing a flight of Thunderbolts diving out of the sun, knowing that in seconds 8 machine guns would be pouring fire into their aircraft. They described the frustration of hitting a P-47 with cannon shells that should have destroyed it, watching it smoke and shudder but keep flying. They described the helplessness of watching the sky fill with American fighters, knowing that the Luftwaffe no longer had the resources to compete. One Luftwaffe pilot, interviewed years after the war, put it simply, "When we first saw the P-47, we thought the Americans had made a mistake. It was too big, too heavy. We thought we would shoot them down easily. We were wrong. The P-47 was no mistake. It was a war winner. And those 8 guns, they changed everything. You could not survive if those guns found you, and they found us. Over and over they found us. That might be the P-47's greatest achievement. It took the mockery of its enemies and turned it into fear. It took the skepticism of its own pilots and turned it into trust. It proved that American industrial might and engineering skill could produce weapons that matched or exceeded anything the world's most experienced military powers could build. And it did all of this while bringing thousands of American pilots home alive, pilots who might have died in lesser aircraft. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was never beautiful. It was never graceful. It was big and heavy and practical, built to do a job that needed doing. But it did that job better than anyone expected. Better than its enemies thought possible. It dominated the skies over Europe for 2 years, and in doing so it helped win a war and save civilization. The Germans called it the Jug, and they meant it as an insult. American pilots took that name and made it a badge of honor. They climbed into their Jugs every morning, flew into hell, fought their way out, and came home. They did this day after day, month after month, until the war was won, and when they landed for the last time, they climbed out of their cockpits, patted their aircraft on the nose, and thanked it for bringing them home. That big, ugly, beautiful machine had earned their gratitude, and it had earned its place in history, not as a joke, but as one of the finest fighter aircraft ever built.